So, one day I get an email from this indie studio, Omega Entertainment. They asked me if I'd be interested in playing and reviewing their game Tower Song, and short story even shorter, here we are. I had never heard of Tower Song before they contacted me, and by the looks of things, not many other people have either, so what the heck, a review to maybe get the word out there. This game is definitely interesting enough to talk about, and it's not very long, only 9 to 10 hours, which I appreciate. Also, real quick, some of the footage is kind of blurry because I screwed up my recording settings, that's completely on me. And finally, here's a spoiler warning and a timestamp to skip past the story recap. This game's plot isn't incredibly twist-heavy, but it does have some moments. To start with said plot, it's simultaneously easy to understand, but was difficult for me to completely comprehend what was actually happening. It begins 5 years after an event called The Breach, following Solas and her sister Naria in a tower run through the fire tower, which already throws me off like 10 seconds into the game. Since this game never does flashback sequences to like the characters' childhoods or a time before The Breach, you have to go out of your way fairly often to talk to NPCs or examine overworld objects to get an idea of what this world is like. Usually it's the main character's soulless lore dumping at you, but other characters get into it as well occasionally. This is all to say, I'll explain the plot the best I can, but I'm sure there's some holes here or there. Alright, going back a second. 5 years ago, an event called The Breach happened, which from what I can tell was when a whole bunch of monsters came out of the towers and killed a ton of people. The towers are big mechanical structures that are in various places around the world, and a lot of towns are built around them for some reason. I think the people mine resources and materials out of it, so it's kind of like building a town next to a mine shaft. And the mine shaft occasionally opens up into hell. Despite being the main omnipresent threat of the game, I never really understood what the towers actually do aside from generate monsters. The prologue begins, as mentioned, with Solas and her sister Naria. How do I pronounce this? Okay, to get this out of the way, character names are all over the place in this game. On the one hand, you've got that and Porphyry, and on the other, you've got Tali and Fred. Anyway, these two are doing a tower run to hopefully destroy the tower. Solas also has the help of her Mana Knight friends, who infiltrate the tower at different points to disrupt it in various ways to lead everyone to the center. Once everyone joins up and beats the boss, they realize something called the Tower Song has started, which does something. I think it acts as a general nuisance throughout the world, as it can be heard from very long distances and makes monsters appear, along with causing some inhabitants to become song-addled where they're frozen in place. But even though the plan was going well, things go bad, and Naria is left in the tower while Tali teleports the group out to safety. With the Council, who I assume is a big group of evil people, closing the fire tower until further notice, the group is stuck on options of how to deal with it. Solas, not happy with the tower run going awry and losing her sister, wants to find another Mana Knight, Kieran, who she says has been studying the towers for years now. The rest of the group is not on board with this because they say Kieran is a total dick who probably won't help them and is only studying the towers for his own satisfaction. Plus, they can't just leave the fire tower alone with the tower song going off. So they make a new plan. Solas and one other party member of your choosing will head off to find Kieran, and the rest will stay back and make sure nothing bad happens to the town. At this point, you pick one of the other 4 party members to permanently stick with you throughout the game, and luckily the game gives you a chance to save here, since this is where the biggest source of replayability comes in. I picked Tali because she's actually 2 party members, herself and her cat, and her moves were cool, but I'll get into that later. So now we're off to the north, but before that, there's something that's been bugging me. What's up with the character portraits? I don't mean like what's wrong with the art, because the actual artistic quality of the whole game is pretty great, especially the portraits. I more mean, why does everyone only have one portrait for talking? These types of cutscenes exist in lots of different kinds of games, and even the bad ones have the sense to make different emotions and portraits to suit the scene. Having one character be perpetually grinning, or one constantly looking into space, or this cat, makes it hard to get invested. Imagine if, like, the new Smash Bros. Had a story mode, and all the cutscenes were done in this style, but the only character portraits were their character select screen renders. That's what this feels like. Maybe I'm being a little too harsh here, but it was something that I kept thinking about for the whole game, and there's a lot of characters, so it just kept coming up. There's also the fact that this game kind of expects a lot out of you. You're thrust into a brand new world with lots of lore and terminology yet to be explained to you, with characters you've only known for a half hour, and now the game wants you to go find another character to maybe solve this problem that just started, or maybe he'll do nothing at all. I think story setups like this do work for certain types of people. I mean, look at the Dark Souls guys, but for me, not so much. Although I guess while I'm talking about this, I'll sidestep the plot for a second to talk about the presentation overall. I might have just been shit-talking the cutscenes, but the presentation is pretty good. It's definitely noticeable that this is an RPG Maker game, but the overworld tile sets look good, the areas look decently diverse, the character portraits, while limited, are very detailed and nice looking, the attacking effects in battle look cool, the battle backgrounds look great, and the music is decent. Nothing super memorable, but I did enjoy what I was listening to, the battle music in particular. I did notice at least one default RPG Maker sound in there, but I think the vast majority of it is custom. Characters will also talk in combat sometimes, usually during boss fights, and at first I didn't even realize they were because it's at the top of the screen, with no sounds or anything indicating that something's happening. For the first half of the game, I probably missed the beginning of every battle conversation. It is nice that the devs were smart enough to not put it directly over important information, or have it take place before combat, making the cutscene take longer, but since it's so easy to miss, it just strikes me as weird. There are some typos here and there, there seems to be a sprite sheet problem in one of Tally's walking sprites, and I was able to just walk through walls sometimes. However, 99% of the game is super polished. Plus all that stuff I just mentioned could very easily be patched out, nothing game breaking. I think the weirdest thing that happened was in this bonus area called Larif's Doom. It started fine, but after being there for like 5 or 10 minutes, it started running at a super stuttery frame rate and got hard to look at. I can't imagine that an RPG Maker game has trouble rendering an overworld, but also this was the only location it happened at. It's too bad that that happened too, because the puzzles in there seemed really interesting. Last note, the game is pretty quiet, but occasionally a random sound effect will be like 20 times louder than anything else. Anyway, let's continue with that story. Once they get to the Soul Tower to the north, they find Kieran pretty quickly, fighting some weird ghost knights. Tally has been non-stop shit-talking this guy the entire trip, so at this point I'm mostly curious to see if it's all warranted. Gameplay-wise, I was just glad to see that his moveset is significantly less complicated. Once the knights are beaten, some guy called the Guardian shows up, who Kieran says he's been hunting for years. Extraordinarily convenient that as soon as we show up, he also does, but the Guardian says what we came here to say and informs Kieran that the Fire Tower's song has started up. He just brushes that off, and the two of them exchange extremely vague, foreshadowy things before we fall down a pit and have to climb back out. Unsurprisingly for Tally, Kieran doesn't care about Solas's sister being trapped in the tower, and is still invested in his tower-crawling shenanigans. And honestly, I don't necessarily blame him. I mean, he's apparently been here for 5 years, he's way past gambler's fallacy at this point. An interesting detail here is that Kieran says Solas left behind her sister when they were children. Narya is a forged child, which is basically a fancy way of saying a slave. The council gets kids to do the extremely dangerous job of being housekeepers for the towers, cleaning them, upkeeping them, making sure the monster problem doesn't get too bad, which sounds kinda counterproductive. It's just all bad. Solas kinda ditched her when they were kids, and still harboring that guilt from however long ago, wants to set things right by not letting the same thing happen again. Unfortunately for her, Kieran has to settle things with the Guardian, who he says he saw at the breach. A side note, again. Kieran says, "Do you doubt its existence?" as if the Guardian is some magical thing that the characters don't believe actually exists, like he's the Tooth Fairy or something. I'm pretty sure this is the first time that the Guardian has been brought up to me. I mean, we've only been playing for like, what, 45 minutes, an hour? And we just saw it, so this whole detail of is the Guardian real or not seems super pointless. Kieran also says this tower is shift-locked and can't move, which probably means something to someone. Against Tally's wishes, the two join up with Kieran to find the Guardian and, I guess, find out the truth. I will say though, Tally and Kieran's banter is pretty great to watch. Tally has a little too much quirky sarcasm in her for my liking sometimes, but these two just constantly shit-talking each other to their faces is a nice change of pace from the rest of the dialogue. It's just a constant stream of hatred, no hidden inner emotions or anything. After some Minish Cap puzzles, we find the center of the tower in about an hour, despite Kieran searching for it for 5 years. Kieran wants to try and interrogate the Guardian for answers to try and stop a future breach from potentially happening, so naturally Soul is blasted in the head before we learn anything useful. It did mention something about cycles and things being different, so I was expecting this to turn into like a time loop story, but no, just a vague villain being vague. Now that the Guardian is gone, Kieran decides to join us, probably for self-satisfactory reasons, and on the way back we're beset by bandits at this normally busy trade passageway. And then the next screen over is a set of new playable characters being attacked by some evil snake people, which is way cooler than what we had to deal with. Okay, so, real quick, look at this character. Take a guess on what this character's name is. Fred. This lady looks completely batshit evil, but all of her dialogue is like it's being written for an entirely unrelated character. Does some concept art get switched around somewhere? Not to mention that her gameplay is entirely revolved around using her HP to cast spells, and then getting that HP back with a vampiric basic attack with that big-ass scythe. It's really hard to get over all this. I hope that a character in a route I didn't pick brings this up, because no one ever does in my playthrough. She doesn't betray the party or do much of anything, really. Anyway, these three, Akaino, Hudson, and Fred, are the Mist Legion, who Solas knows very well, and they were sent here because of a distress call, so it's a good thing we all met up here. There's a lot of back and forth, but the gist of it is that while those Ghost Knights from earlier were being made from the Soul Tower, these Naga are being made from the Fire Tower, and since the Fire Tower is right where we left our party, that spells bad news for them. Similarly bad is that in the neighboring town, the Naga basically have a stronghold on everything. Akaino comes with us to wreck shit, and they make it through to the Temple of the Fire Priestess, who apparently Naria was. She was a slave and got promoted to being a priestess. That's one hell of a corporate ladder. Once we get there, it's Counselor Dundale. From Solas's reaction, I assume he wasn't always a Voldemort-style snake monster. I guess the Tower Song can just do that to you. Also, if you didn't already assume that a council of people that enslaved children to work in monster-ridden evil towers were bad guys, I don't know what to tell you. Once we take care of them, we discover what everyone was thinking. The starting town has been overrun by evil snake monsters, but luckily Solas knows a secret way in to start wrecking shit from the inside. So we do just that and boom, more counselors. And they're evil snake men too, how about that? That goes about the same, and we finally meet back up with the original party to get all the Naga out of the town. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a hollow victory. They've lost the vast majority of their army, and the food and water supplies are cripplingly low. And that's on top of the Tower Song problem. So Kieran brings up the great point that it really doesn't matter how to fix the town right now. If the tower stays as is, then everything will be for nothing. With all the entrances to the core blocked, the answer is obvious. Just start blowing stuff up from the inside, and something will probably happen. That's as good a plan as any, let's do it. The Fire Tower Revisit is actually the final dungeon about 7 hours into the game, and something cool I find here is that in the prologue, one of the enemies is a lost child, who are probably forged children that are being brainwashed by the Tower Song. However, now they've been replaced with these new, much more dangerous and mutated enemies, so I'm assuming that the lost children have fully fallen to the Fire Tower. After beating all of the most annoying enemies in the game back to back and dealing with equally annoying switch flipping puzzles, we're ready to find out some crazy stuff after Kieran finds some kind of master computer thing in the center of the tower. First off, there's actually 6 Guardians, which presumably means 1 for each tower. Then it says something about creating a disruption to force a new cycle, which makes me think that a cycle is supposed to be the in-game term for a year, maybe? The most notable thing here is Kieran trying to learn how to replace a Guardian with someone new, but the computer refuses to be any more descriptive there. And then he gets attacked by 2 guys that look vaguely like him, which is very sudden and probably doesn't mean anything important. But Kieran is pretty transparent about his desire to become a new Guardian. I guess it kinda makes sense, be the new leader to have more control on dismantling everything from the inside. But here we are in the main chamber of the fire tower, and there's Narya. How convenient. But I guess she's evil and gonna be the final boss. I'm gonna be honest, I predicted this as soon as she was left behind in the prologue. Narya is at least the only character to get more than one dialogue portrait. Good for her. Solas and her go back and forth for a while, but we all know how this is gonna go. Kieran tries to murder her, which I found a little weird since he got on their asses for blasting the first Guardian to EBDB, but once again I felt myself siding with Kieran here. I'd probably feel differently if I was more attached to these characters, but even after a 10-hour adventure with all these side dialogues, I feel like I still barely know these people. So seeing someone like Kieran who just confidently strides up and goes, "I'm going to kill your sister to help save the world," makes me go, yeah sure, go for it, whatever. And Narya agrees with him too, so that doesn't help. But he gets chased off and Narya says a bunch of stuff in a row. The towers are basically gods, they can't be destroyed, and she can become the tower song, which basically means she'll invert the song's meaning to make it good instead of evil, I guess. Narya says to seek out the other tower guardians and help them as they've helped her. She vanishes and the game ends. Alright, pretty heavy cliffhanger. Presumably there'll be sequel games in the future, but for right now, that's where it ends. The story is alright. The short length is both a blessing and a curse, because while it didn't help me get invested in the story and characters too much, it did let me enjoy the gameplay more before it got too tedious. We might as well move on to said gameplay. I mentioned at the beginning that this game was made in RPG Maker, and it definitely shows. The overworld, the battles, the whole presentation is very much souped up RPG Maker game. Now I've talked shit on a lot of RPG Maker games before, because I've always believed that it's nearly impossible to have engaging gameplay in this engine, even if the story is fantastic. Often Omori come to mind in particular. As for this game, I was surprised that I actually enjoyed it a lot. It's definitely the best RPG Maker gameplay I've ever experienced, although similar to the plot, it makes a horrible first impression. First off, the amount of things I can click on is way too high. Sniper is the only one even remotely relevant because Talents just explains your character's passives, and Examine lets you look at a character to see what buffs, debuffs, or other statuses they have. And if you press X to go to the guidebook, then God help you. But even after that, you hit Sniper, and I have 3 moves already? I can shoot them, I guess, but I can also Sniper's Mark. Why are there icons in the move descriptions? Why does it only sometimes have the word associated with the icon, and sometimes not? Why are the descriptions so long? Wait, I can reload? Where are my bullets? I didn't even realize the purple meter below your HP was the current bullets until like 3 hours in, because no battle lasts long enough for you to need to reload with 8 goddamn bullets. And all this happened to me in the first 2 minutes of starting a new vial. Even if it's not actually as complicated as it looks, it's just an overwhelming amount of information for this early. However, once I got past the word diarrhea hurdle, I found that the systems in place were actually pretty engaging. Every playable character plays very differently from each other, and just about everyone has a different resource. A lot of characters have MP, naturally, but Solas has both great party buffs, fantastic single target damage, and uses bullets as her resource. Neat, or Niat, I don't know, has a combo gauge that goes up as he attacks and unlocks more attacks as he builds the combo. Akeno has 4 different elemental stances that affect his moves, and can build up a separate meter when he spends his MP to use even more spells. Porphyry has a rage meter that basically builds up over time to turn her into a mega damage berserker. Tally picks 2 random cards out of a pool of 6, and has access to Gigi, her familiar, and I'd be here all day if I fully explained everyone. There's so many playable characters with so many moves, so it's super impressive that they were able to come up with this many ideas without much overlap. Something that is potentially contentious is that there's no experience in this game. Your party levels up at set story points. The most obvious comparison here is something like Sticker Star, but I think it's way better than that. First, enemy encounters are finite, so you'll eventually be able to walk around the overworld unabated. Second, fights are much more involved because there can be up to 8 enemies against you at once, and boss fights are not immune to the high enemy counts. Adding on to that is that your party fully recovers and all your items are restored after every fight, so you're fully encouraged to go all out. You even get the option of going to the menu to re-equip people before immediately retrying the fight if you happen to game over. But let's actually get into that combat. Every unit in the battle goes in a set order based on their initiative stat. Not only can you see the turn order on the side of the screen, you're also able to see what enemies are going to do on their turn. Super useful for trying to take out or debilitate enemies trying to go for a stun or a full party attack. This does mean that to an extent, initiative is kind of the god stat, because going after the enemy would make that aspect of combat pretty pointless. But speed being the god stat in a turn-based RPG isn't exactly a new thing. You can also see a unit's current status, like what effects they might currently have, or buffs or debuffs, so there's no guesswork on whether your buffs have ran out, or an enemy's stun is gone or anything. This game is very quality of life rich, which is very nice. Characters will naturally learn new moves over the course of the story, and unlock mod slots, which are just choose one of 2 new moves. The mods idea gives the system a whole lot of variability, but also some of the mods are kinda no-brainers. Like, just take it from me, it's not a good idea to remove Fred's heal damage dealt basic attack, because replacing it with one that only heals for 50 is just it's not a good idea. But man, characters get a ton of moves. By the end of the game, you have so many that you have to scroll the menu to see the rest. And this isn't like a Final Fantasy kind of long move list either, where you'll just never use these spells, and all that matters are the last few you get. Just about every move every character gets is useful up until the very end of the game. And combat eventually got to a point where I had too many options to pick from, especially Solus, who is combination support mage and fuck your health bar DPS. There are a couple of junk ones, like I don't think I ever used Kieran's magic damage attack because the minimum damage is 1. But for the most part, character movesets don't get deprecated, which is great. Also, I'm not sure when it's best to mention this, so I'll just say it now. This game does have crafting, however, it's one of the least offensive crafting systems I've ever seen in a game. You unlock it right after the prologue, and my initial response was one of despair. But just like the combat, the game basically goes out of its way to make it as convenient as possible. So first off, crafting mostly only requires money and like one other item that I think you get from beating enemies or finding in chests around the overworld. This is the only thing the money is used for, so beating all the encounters in the game will have you a surplus of the stuff. Second, you can freely refund anything you craft to get all of your money and materials back, so there's no risk if you end up making something you don't like, or you find a duplicate item out in the wild, or once you unlock the higher tiered stuff. But the only things I ever ended up crafting were like 1 weapon per character per tier, because I very rarely got more than 1 crafting item for the tier of stuff that I wanted. I was constantly picking up stuff in the overworld that the game said was for crafting, but I don't know, I must have been misunderstanding what I was getting. My brain kinda shunts crafting related information out because it's not a game mechanic I ever get invested in. But crafting is whatever. I think the real selling point here is how well all your party members synergize with one another. Although you definitely hope so, given how many of them there are. Some examples from my playthrough. I said earlier that I picked the cat girl Tali. I initially picked her because she's 2 characters, herself and her cat. But the cat gets its own share of upgrades and new moves. Like one of Tali's card effects, it debuffs the entire enemy's physical defense, which is amazing just on the face of it. And one of the cat's unlockable moves replaces its regular attack with one that does bonus damage to enemies with any debuff, turning him from someone you use to finish off low health enemies into a legitimate damage dealer for several turns. And even if I was unlucky enough to not get that card, and I used her get 2 new cards move and still didn't get it, then Solus has a debuff enemy attack move just to make sure that the cat will still be doing double damage one way or another. And I say unlucky as if the rest of Tali's cards aren't also awesome. She can do big damage to one enemy, do good damage to random enemies, basically fully heal someone's HP and MP, which she can also use on herself, and separate from the random card drawing, she just has a inflict random debuff move. This whole debuff thing is notable in that buffs and debuffs are actually mutually exclusive for the most part. part. Stuff like regen, bleed, stun, and other random things aren't counted in this, but the easiest way to remove a buff from an enemy is to just debuff them right back, and enemies don't start having debuff moves of their own until pretty late in the adventure. I think my favorite part of this whole debuffing nonsense is that very few enemies are outright immune to stuff like stuns or defense downs. Once again, a handful of enemies are immune very late game, but so many bosses get dumpstered by them until then. But getting back to Synergy, Solas unlocks a move that refills 50% of someone's max MP, and she gets bonus damage on her basic attack equal to how much she healed. My two best uses of this were using it turn 1 on Kieran so he can use his charm skill immediately instead of having to wait a turn, and using it on someone like Tali or Gigi who have insanely high MP pools for mega bonus damage. Plus Gigi's MP is actually his HP, so it's like a double whammy for him. Although it is kinda hard to fully take advantage of that for them, because they regenerate a shit ton of MP per turn. But, on the other hand, Infinite MP Black Mage. Another support ability that Solas gets is to give someone regen, and Kieran has a similar skill where he forces a party member to get all the aggro, but also gives them a big defense buff. Well, luckily, Akaino has a move that hits the entire enemy party, and forces everyone to aggro him anyway. So combining the defense boost with the regen makes him an unkillable aggro machine, especially helped by the fact that when you cast a regen on someone multiple times in a row, the amount healed per turn stacks up, leading you to be able to heal a quarter of your HP per turn. This all just scratches the surface of this battle system. With 3 other characters to play through this game with, I'm sure you'd have a ton of fun experimenting with everyone to find the most busted stuff possible. It reminds me of the very best parts of Final Fantasy V, just without the full party job customizability, obviously. Every character you choose also has a unique overworld ability to get access to different items, but I don't know. I think the party experimentation and new dialogue would be enough of a reason to play through the game again. The items were negligible at best in my run. This game hasn't changed my mind on replayability. I think games being fun makes them way more replayable than games with mutual exclusivity during playthroughs. However, I do think this game has it really good in both senses. Now, all that stuff that I've been saying is enough for me to pretty solidly recommend this game. Even if the story didn't do much for me, the fact that I was playing an RPG Maker game that was actually fun was enough to keep me going to the end. Plus, I do hope they continue with the story. I'd like to try and actually find out what was going on. With that said, it wasn't a totally perfect experience, so here's some of the weirder or more annoying things that happened to me in no particular order. I softlocked a couple times. The first happened in a revisit to the Soul Tower to try and finish a side quest I missed. I walked into this room, then Akaino wanted to endlessly strike up a conversation while walking through the walls. I can't say it's particularly nice chatting right now. The other time was in the middle of going through the Fire Tower revisit, and I just got stuck in the wall. I don't even know how I did this, but thankfully the game autosaves very frequently when you do basically anything, so I never got sent back more than a couple minutes. The Fire Tower revisit is where most of my issues come in, actually, and I'm not even going to count the tiling errors because, like I said earlier, that could be fixed in a patch super easily. So to start with this place, I got lost for like 45 minutes here because I kept walking past an obvious door I was supposed to go in to hit a switch. That wasn't the game's fault, but it did affect my mood because I was getting annoyed from walking around. It just made me feel worse about everything after it. A handful of enemies in this place are super irritating. My most hated enemy here is undoubtedly these Forge Smith guys that always have an effect up that makes you take as much damage as you deal, and it goes through any barriers or shields you might have. The game explicitly tells you that you can remove the effect by inflicting stun or hitting with blunt damage. However, right below that, the game says that they're immune to stun, and oopsies, my party of 3 characters is majority magic damage with no blunt damage in sight. So I have to basically just sacrifice my characters to kill these guys, like throwing myself on a grenade. Eventually I smartened up and gave everyone initiative boosting equipment, but even then, if you don't kill them on turn 1, they'll put that barrier up and you're right back to where you started. The best, in quotation marks, part of that whole thing is that right after you beat the last Forge Smith, Tali gets an attack that inflicts blunt damage, so that's great. The choir director boss fight here was where I finally got a game over, and I got 2 or 3 of them because the setup here is so fucked up. The boss starts off with an innate resistance to magic damage, and he'll almost certainly use a skill early on to make himself immune to physicals. There's a Forge Smith that, as previously mentioned, not only has that reflect damage effect up, but can also make one of the other enemies completely invincible for 2 turns. There are also 2 physically attacking dudes who have a taunt effect that forces your entire party to target them, so if the Forge Smith decides to make that guy invincible, you basically just gotta burn your turns while you're getting wailed on. The boss can also buff everyone's defense, and some of the enemies are immune to debuffs, so without rolling one of Tally's remove buff cards, that's just staying on them for however many turns it lasts normally. Oh yeah, and the ultimate capstone to this is that the boss will revive the enemies with full health, so you have to kill the boss first, pass the invincibility, occasional physical immunity, magical resistance, and taunts. Where the hell did this difficulty spike come from? This was far and away the hardest fight in the entire game. The final boss was not even remotely as difficult as this. And then, after this fight, I get the privilege of walking between 2 rooms to flip 2 different switches. The Fire Tower Revisit has a gimmick of switching between 3 groups of people, where Kieran is just the designated switch flipper for the other 2 parties. At first it's fine, just switch to him, press the button, switch back, but when you get the second switch, you have to walk your dumb ass out into the hallway and into the other room to flip the other switch. This is just so unnecessary and didn't help my mood after getting my ass beat for a half hour straight. So it's a bummer that me getting lost like an idiot kind of started a death spiral that ended up killing my mood. But that doesn't change that I did like the game a lot. Check it out on Steam, the devs are putting out a new game later this year and it looks neat from the screenshots. If they do make sequels to continue the story, maybe I'll check them out to see how they expand on the gameplay and story. It's pretty easy to tell someone has one hell of a story to tell with this world building. But that's all for this game for now. Thank you to Omega Entertainment for giving me a code to this game. It was definitely worth trying out. And until next time, see ya.